It's time to begin tonight. We appreciate so very much for all making the decision to come in for a midweek Bible study. It's always encouraging to see brothers and sisters. Cordell has a dry mouth condition, seemed like what Donnie had, he's now got. So I'm going to be leading the singing tonight. So first song would be number 881. 881. I think Ben's going to put them up on the board. We'll sing just two verses 1 and 2. Now, I normally am a baritone, so I can't, if I sing a while, I can hit some of the high notes. So some of the high notes, I stop, don't you stop. So carry me through, okay? Or I'll strip a gear. You don't want that. 881. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold, but in that city where the ransom will shine, I wanna go on that silver line. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but walk the streets that are purest gold. Don't think me poor or deserted or lonely. I'm not discouraged. I'm heaven bound. I'm just a pilgrim in search of a city. I want a mansion, a robe and a crown. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop in that bright land where we'll never grow old. And someday yonder we will never more wander, but streets that are purest gold. Keeping the theme of heaven, 869. 869. We're marching to Zion. We'll sing verses 1, 2, and 4. 1, 2, and 4. 869. Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus surround the throne, and thus surround the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Let those refuse to sing who never knew our God. But children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Then let our songs abound and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground to fairer worlds on high, to fairer worlds on high. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Song of Invitation 934. 934, softly and tenderly. Before we get to the sick folks, let me remind everybody, Sunday morning will be abbreviating our worship service just for a few minutes, or about 5 or 10 minutes, because we're going to have a budget presentation or financial presentation of where the church is financially. Luke Matthews has Excel and different things that will show us, and then I'll wrap up for about 15 minutes. So it should take about 30 minutes. So we hope you'll stay for that. You know, every member deserves to know where we are financially. And I think most of you realize COVID was not good for our membership, and it certainly hasn't been good for our financial matters. So we need to let you know where we stand and what we need to be doing and issue a challenge to everybody. So please be praying for the church in every regard, especially its financial matters. Be prepared to support the challenge come Sunday. As far as sick folks, Cordell finally gets to go tomorrow to have not the first treatment, but a consultation of the treatments. And so that, I think after that, you'll have 5 regular treatments for the proton therapy, and then see how that looks. So we need to be praying for a good result. Fran Finley was scheduled to do another CT scan with contrast, but there was a few things in her blood work that the doctor was not happy with, and so they postponed that. And so what they're going to do is an MRI first with contrast, get that scheduled, and then look at the information there and go on. So keep her in your prayers. It's good to see her here. I know she doesn't always feel well, but she gets here times when I know most people would be at home and wouldn't even think about going, but we admire her coming. Keep Ruth Ann Chapman in your prayers. She has had a number of health issues. She finally got her CPAP machine back, or a new one. Then the mouthpiece was off on it, so she finally got another mouthpiece, and so she's back in business with that. But not feeling well today with a bad headache or something. Donnie, I think, was scheduled to come in, but he's still having some problems with the Donnie mouth. There he is, still having problems with a dry mouth. You need to not sit behind that big guy in front of you. That's a good place to hide out. But anyway, he's still not out of the woods yet with some of the health issues that he has. But anyway, we hope this dry mouth episode doesn't proceed to any other preacher. We wouldn't want that, would we? All right. If you any other addition to the prayer list? Yes. Yes. Who is it? Luke Devereaux has strep. Okay. Everybody add him to the prayer list. Anybody else? Okay, let's keep Joyce Deakins in prayer. She's had chronic back issues for a long, long time. I know this has gone on several years, and talking with her husband, she does different things. So hopefully some of the shots they've been doing lately will work. So we'll put her on the prayer list for Sunday. Anybody else? Okay. Tell me your name again. Okay. All right. Let's pray for Cindy that she's got it's a tough situation at work, and her financial income has not been stable. That she certainly wants that to stabilize so she can take care of her bills and obligations. Anybody else? If we'll open your Bibles to the book of Hebrews. By the way, for the men that were here this last Sunday, do have a handout of the budget that we've been following over the last 2 or 3 years. So I know that we went through that, but we at least got, before my computer quit, he had 3 handouts. He sent me, at least got the first one. So got about a dozen copies of it. It's on the table in the for you there heading to the fellowship hall. So men, if you want to get that, you can kind of get a heads up of what we'll be covering Sunday. Hebrews 12. If you're familiar with the book of Hebrews, then you know Hebrews 12 follows the great chapter of faith, sometimes referred to as Faith's Hall of Fame. People mention Bible heroes in chapter 11. With that in mind, he writes, therefore, we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let's lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Let's run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, from time to time we see Paul and others using athletic terms, athletic events, and knowing what's been going on in chapter 11, he refers to to a race. And life certainly is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And when you're running, anybody here ever ran on a regular basis? I know there's been a few of us that did that. I know back when I was about 26 or 27, after coming home from a submarine patrol, I never run over 3 or 4 miles in my life. My mother-in-law had signed me up for the first Expo 10,000 meter road race. That started in a year before the World's Fair was to start. It started in 81. And she signed me up, said, I've signed you up for this race. It's 10,000 meters. I had no idea how far that was. And so I got involved and ran, I just jogged through it. I found out I couldn't run on Thursday, 6 miles, but just going to jog. And then young guys passed me, and then older guys passed me. Then younger girls passed me, and then some older girls passed me, and somewhere along the way the competitive edge kicked in, and I finished the race throwing up everything I'd had for about 2 weeks. But I found out from my time it really wasn't that bad a race, and so I stopped weightlifting and started running. And for about 3 or 4 years, I got kind of obsessed with running. Got to the point where I was running 60 miles a week. And so when you're running races, if you know somebody that's pretty good, it helps. The fastest race I ever had was a 10.2 mile race in northern Massachusetts on the coast. I was doing pretty good, and then a guy passed me, an older guy. I thought, that guy's at least, I was 28, and I found out later the guy was 54 years old. Oh, there's no way. That old man is going to pass me. And so I latched on. This was about mile 3, and the guy never slowed down. Mile 4, mile 5, mile 6, and I could look at my time, the best time I ever ran. I mean, I finished a 10.2 mile race in 59 minutes. So for those of you that know, that's a pretty good time. Throwing up right and left. But he finished about 6, and I finished number 12, the best I ever did in a race. I wouldn't have even come close to that except trying to run to keep up with this old man who I found out was a running legend, in Massachusetts. So I wish I'd known that ahead of time. It probably took about 2 years off my life or heart anyway. But, when you're running behind somebody, that's good, it helps. Anybody ever heard of Billy Mills? Billy Mills. He was the first American to win the 10,000 meter run in the Olympics. He was a Sioux Indian. He ran for the University of Kansas. And being a Sioux Indian at that time, back in the 60s, he met a lot of prejudice. Nobody expected him to do anything. He barely made the team, and they'd take the top 3 runners in each position, and nobody gave him a chance at all. But to the surprise of everybody, it's about 4 times around the track, times 6, 25 laps around the track there. But a lap or 2 ago, he was still among the leaders. And then some of the leaders that normally finish fast got ahead of him. But if you go ahead and put in YouTube Billy Mills and watch his stretch run, if you look at they come around the corner, they got about 100 yards to go. In all my years, I've never seen anybody run that last 80 yards as fast as he did. It's like, he had a jetpack on, and he was motivated. And so he became, when I found that out, my new hero. Read everything I could, read a biography. There was a movie made about him in the 70s. So it helps to have somebody that you can look to while you're running. And that's what's behind Hebrews chapter 12, the Christian race. We have the greatest one who's run, our Lord. He came here to the earth and spent 33 years to show us how to live and show us how to run and overcome the obstacles in life. Let's look at that passage again. Since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, lay aside every weight. Some of you may have played basketball and have ankle weights, but when you time to race, you get up the weight so you can run fast. The sin which so easily ensnares us, and run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking unto Jesus. If we can keep our eyes on the right thing, then we'll do well. Anybody remember the story of a disciple that saw Jesus walking on the water in a storm? And he said, sir, Jesus bid me to come walk. He said, come on. And what happened? He got out of the boat, and after a while, reality struck him in the face, and he began to sink when he took his eyes off the Lord. And finally, he cried out, Lord, save me. And the Lord did, got him back in the boat, and said, O thou of little faith. Your faith will fail you if you keep your focus on you or others around you. The only way you can ever make it is keep your eyes on Jesus. He kept running. because of the missionary of the text, because of the joy that was set before him. People train because of the race and the expectation of doing well in races. But we're training for the race of life. And if we finish that race here in the way and following the rules of the competition that the Lord has set out for us, then the greatest crown of all, the crown of righteousness, will be given us at that last day. And so we run. So we gather together tonight to see more so about how we ran. That's why we study collectively as a group. That's why we study individually, to keep our eyes on Jesus and then learn everything about how he trained and what he did, and to follow his thoughts, follow his speech, follow his manner of life, follow the good examples that he did. And so while we're here, take advantage of every Bible lesson. We've got good teachers here at this place, so use the time wisely. If you're not a Christian, we give you the opportunity to become one. The Christian race, if you're not even in it, you're not going to finish and gain the reward of heaven. And so if you're at that point in time in your life where your heart has been pricked by things that you've now learned and studied, things you now know about your own life, the sin that you're in, and want that sin problem to be taken care of, then you can respond tonight, have the opportunity to be able to do that by believing, first of all, that he is the Christ. That's where it starts. Hebrews 11, verse 6, without faith it's impossible to please God. He that cometh to God must believe that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And so that seeking is modified by the word diligent, that adverb there. It can't be just a casual thing. It has to be a diligent following all the days of our life. The mindset of repentance must always be there, not just on the road to becoming a Christian. If you read and study God's word and keep your eyes open, you will from time to time see things in which your life falls short. The sins, the shortcomings are there. The attitude of repentance must always be there, but especially on the road to becoming a Christian, where you don't want to keep doing the things that you want. There's godly sorrow that leads to the point where in your mind you say, I'm going to stop doing that, and resolve to do better. You have to be willing to make the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and finally have your sins washed away. If you're at that point now tonight where you're ready to complete your obedience, it would be a proud thing to be able to see you do that. If you're a Christian but not as well as you could have been, not meeting the challenges of Christianity, know that you in honesty have done better in times past. You got the opportunity to make things right tonight. If there are burdens, spiritual things that are going on, that you know you need help in the prayers of the church, we're here for you. So now the invitation is up to you if you need to respond. We'd invite you to do so now. Together we stand and sing. Will you come? Softly and tenderly Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. See on the portals he's waiting and watching, watching for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, oh sinner, come home. Why should we tarry when Jesus is pleading, pleading for you and for me? Why should we linger and heed not his mercies, mercies for you and for me? Come home, come home. Ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tender, Jesus is calling, calling, oh sinner, come home. Oh, for the wonderful love he has promised, promise for you and for me. Though we have sinned, he has mercy and pardon, pardon for you and for me. Come home, come home. Ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, oh sinner, come home. Donnie, would you word the prayer? Then we'll be dismissed our classes.
Evening, everybody. I appreciate Bill leading the songs and leading the devotional talk tonight. The guy stays pretty busy, doesn't he? So we are going to be in class 7 tonight in our lesson. The topic is going to be the future viewing faith of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So let's all turn to Hebrews 11. Again, going through this series on the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 that Bill just alluded to. Last week we studied Abraham, and hard to cover all that material. There's a lot of detail about Abraham's life and his journeys and the dangers that he went through. And the lesson we take away from Abraham was he was willing to follow God's commands, travel to a foreign land, leave his comfort, undertake that great journey, knowing that he had trusted in God to put him in a greater place eventually, and also trusting in God to honor the covenant for his lineage, that he would be the father of a great nation, and also honoring God's commitment that he would have a son in his old age. We talked about how Abram waited 25 years in between the initial covenant and when his son Isaac was born, then about the faith that it would require to follow the command to sacrifice his son, knowing that Abraham started to perform that sacrifice with a firm belief that God would resurrect Isaac. And that's about where we left off. So where our topic for tonight is continuing that. And in Genesis, Abraham is the start of a 4-generation story from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I don't have any copies up here. I saw them on the back table there. Yeah, and I'm sorry, we've got more copies of lessons 7 through 10 on the back table in the foyer there if y'all need it. So let's turn together to Hebrews chapter 11. Now, structurally, this chapter is interesting because Hebrews 11 starts telling about the faith of Abel, Enoch, Noah, and then Abraham. And then in verse 13, there's somewhat of a pause and a mid-chapter summary. And that's where I'd like to pick up here and read verses 13 through 16, reflect on what that says, and then pick up in verse 17 and go through Abraham and his lineage. So Hebrews 11, verses 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So going into this passage, again, a mid-chapter summary, says, these all died in faith, referring to the previously forementioned heroes of faith. Now, he mentions Abel, and in summary, Abel's faith empowered him to offer a more acceptable sacrifice to God, a sacrifice that was better than his brother Cain's. And he offered that through faith, even though he came from a family of literal exiles from the Garden of Eden. Abel must have resisted the temptation to offer a lesser sacrifice or hold a grudge against God for that exile. So Abel was an exile from Eden, wanting to go and get into a homeland with God, and offered a more superior sacrifice. I don't mean he was a literal exile from Eden, but he comes from the family that is exiled from Eden. But next in the list is Enoch. We didn't study him individually, but by faith he walked with God. His faith was so strong that God took him from this earth. He didn't see death. So Enoch walked with God, and he sojourned from this world into heaven and did not see a literal death. Noah, we studied. Through faith, he built the ark. He followed God's difficult commands to build an ark, which he'd never seen or heard of before, over a long period of time. And then he sojourned from his home in the wicked land we read about in Genesis 6. He sojourned through the flood to safety in the new world, which was washed clean after the flood. So Noah was a sojourner also, and he was able to do so with his faith. And then Abraham, as we studied last week, through his faith, he sojourned from his homeland to a new homeland where God would honor that commitment over an immense period of time. Over multiple generations and hundreds of years, God would honor that commitment. And that's a covenant that Abraham never saw fully materialized, but Abraham's faith was still strong enough that he trusted God to fulfill the promise to his lineage, even after Abraham was long gone. So going back to Hebrews, in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith. That's speaking in more general terms. Enoch didn't die, but I don't think the writer is going to say 3 out of 4 died in faith. He's going to speak in general terms about Enoch. So that's not a contradiction if you think about it from that point of view. It's a general statement. So these 4 Hebrews we've read about are all sojourners, and we see a theme here. They all sojourned from a temporary land to a promised land where they would be in a better place with God. And they also thought long-term. They thought about the long-term spiritual blessings and not about the short-term material blessings that they'd be giving up. So with those thoughts, we'll continue on in verse 17, and we'll read about these 4 generations, and then we'll focus on Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and their future viewing faith. So Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. And that's where we stopped last week. Continuing on in verse 20. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So time doesn't allow us to go into each one of these heroes of faith individually. What I'd like to do in this class is go through a few high points in the history that we have recorded, talk about some of their notable individual points in their lives, but then also talk about these 3 and some of their common ground when it comes to the strength of their faith. So if we first think about Abraham, it's impossible to think about Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph without thinking about Abraham, since he is the first of the 4 generations here. Again, as I mentioned, Abraham's promises were all rooted in something that would happen in the far future, some of the fulfillment which he wouldn't see until after he was dead and gone. We talked about he waited 25 years for Isaac, and then he's going to wait centuries. He would be waiting centuries to see things materialize. Now, before we go on to Isaac, I want to look at another promise of Abraham that we didn't talk about last week. Let's turn to Genesis 15 together. Genesis 15, and I'm going to read verses 12 through 16. We'll read about a dream interaction where God appeared to Abraham and gave him another aspect of the covenant. Genesis 15, verses 12. It reads, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out to you with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So we think about this. Abram has received a covenant that he would have a son in his old age, that he'd be the father of a great nation. Excuse me. I'm feeling kind of parched myself tonight, so bear with me. But it's not all good news. God appears to Abraham in a dream. And read that description again in verse 12. "Behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him." So this is a pretty serious situation here. Imagine having a dream vision from God, and for all the hopes of the great lineage, God says that they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. You know, that's a pretty sour turn on that covenant, is it? Yet, Abraham's faith didn't falter from that. He said, I'm going to have a son in my old age. I'm going to have a great lineage. We're going to be the father of a great nation. However, there's going to be 400 years of affliction. So Abraham takes the good with the bad. His faith doesn't falter. And he knows that even though there'll be affliction long term, the blessings are going to outnumber the afflictions that they'll face. So Abram remained faithful despite this grim prophecy here. Now, if we think about the timeline, 400 years of affliction, well, that comes after about 200 years of the next generations. If you go and add up the timeline from Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph to the time of slavery, that's all about 600 years from Isaac to the Exodus. So a great long-term plan right there. Imagine if God was to give us a vision and says that I'm going to do a few good things for you in this lifetime, but your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to have something really nice. Kind of hard for us to envision. So we think about the faith that's required. Now, I wanted to go and touch on Abraham again because Abraham is the shining example of faith that sets the example for Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And I like to think that these 4 consecutive generations, their faith builds on the previous generation. Isaac could look back on his father and see examples of faith and be faithful because of the way that Abraham lived. Likewise, Jacob, even though he was a knucklehead a lot of the times, a lot of things you read his story and you shake your head and say, why'd you do that, Jacob? Picking a lot of fights with his brother and other things that seems ill-advised. Jacob would still be able to look back at Isaac and Abraham and their example of faith. And even though he made some questionable decisions, Jacob would still be able to keep his faith strong. And then Joseph's one of the few people in the Bible where we don't see, mistakes or missteps or a dark side. You think about everything that Joseph endured when he was sold to slavery. He had to rise to authority. He had all those challenges, but in the end, he ended up with a great amount of power, yet he remained loyal to his lineage. Joseph's faith carried him through all those trials, and then when he got to a place of comfort, Joseph's faith helped him to stay loyal to the true God instead of returning to the false Egyptian gods. I question if Joseph's faith would have been that great if he didn't have the example of his father Jacob, grandfather Isaac, and great-grandfather Abraham to go by. So that's why I want to take a step back and get a running start on Abraham. Abraham was faithful on behalf of his descendants that he would never meet. And without his example, the future generations, I doubt that they would have been as strong. So let's go person by person and just talk about a few examples where they had their utmost faith, and also correlate a few historical examples in Genesis to what's briefly mentioned in Hebrews 11. And at any time, I don't want this to be a history lecture. At any time, stop me, ask questions, bring up a point. Let's make sure there's some dialogue too, but I'm just going to try and cover some historical points as we talk about multiple people this week. So, yes, sir. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll just repeat that comment. For anybody listening at home or anybody that couldn't hear Cordell saying one of the significant things about Abraham is he didn't know where he was going. He doesn't have all the luxuries that we have today. Either with the maps or with how we get there. So imagine the hardships and the uncertainty that he would have overcome. So, thank you for that comment, Cordell. Move it up. Yeah. How about that? What's that? 2 tats. Well, is that a standard unit of measurement? Tennessee measurements? Yeah. How is that compared to a hair? Move it up a hair. One tat is 5 hairs. Well, anyways, we're off topic. Let's talk about Isaac. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 24. And let's talk about some examples of Isaac's faith here. Now, if we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, before we get back into Genesis, let's draw exactly what Hebrews exemplifies their faith for. So in verse 20, Hebrews 11:20, it says, "By faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau." So we'll keep that in mind. And before we get to that example at the end of Isaac's life, let's read chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. And we'll talk about this passage. So Genesis 24, verses 1. "Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, 'Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac.'" So we'll pause there. So evidently, Abraham migrated to the promised land, but some of the family and lineage was still back in their own home country. And then Isaac is saying, it's time for my son to be married. Instead of a local Canaanite, let's stay within that lineage, the lineage that would become, the greater nation of Israel. Picking up in verse 5, "The servant said to him, Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, To your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free of this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham and his master and swore to him concerning this matter." Forgive me, I think I just mixed up the name Isaac and Abraham there, but Abraham is sending his servant back to his original homeland to find a wife for his son Isaac, because Abraham thinking long in the future, wants Isaac's wife to be part of his greater lineage and keep that pure and unadulterated from any Canaanite people that might be pagan and a distraction from following the true God. So Abraham here, thinking long term with not just an example of faith, but setting up his son, Isaac, to be married to other followers of the true God. So, getting lost in my notes here. If we go down to another far-reaching vision, chapter 26, we have another message to Isaac. Chapter 26, verses 1 reads, "Now there was famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So one, as we just read, Abraham commanded Isaac to keep his family pure within the lineage of Abraham. And then next, when Isaac himself comes upon hard times with famine, God appears to him and reiterates the promise to Abraham. And God says, Isaac, basically, just like I promised your father Abraham, you're going to have a great lineage. You have a promised land. Do not go down to Egypt. If you go down to Egypt at this time, basically, there's going to be temptation to fall away or something that's going to prevent the fulfillment of the covenant there. So when God appears to Isaac to give him a warning, he reiterates the covenant to Abraham. So I think the same covenant 2 generations in a row, but again, God's thinking long term. It's not just a promise to Abraham that Abraham will see in his lifetime, but it's a promise to multiple generations that's going to be fulfilled in the far future. So Isaac being told to look for a wife from his lineage, that's a future consideration, and then reiteration of the covenant and the future fulfillment there. Now, one thing I missed in my notes is if we go back to another aspect of Abraham. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip back to something I missed. Genesis chapter 23, again, the example that Abraham set for his son Isaac. I want to read in Genesis chapter 23. This is around the death of Sarah and her burial. A couple of things I want to call out here that I think is pretty worth noting for Abraham and the example he set. 23 verses 1. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. So a couple things. One, Sarah being 127 years old, she was only with Isaac a short amount of time, a little bit over 30 years if we look back at her age. So think about it, a majority of her life had Isaac in her 90s and then, died about 30 years later. So only a minority of her life she had Isaac with her, or a smaller fraction then. But in verse 4, Abraham identifies himself to the Hittites as a sojourner, a foreigner. And then note the Hittites' response in verse 5. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. So Hittites, what do they call him? You are a prince of God among us. You think about the impact that Abraham must have had on the pagan nations when he sojourned and when he migrated. So his reputation as a prince of God amongst the pagans, you think about what example that would set for his sons and his descendants. So truly a great reputation. And then one final thing, note the name of the cave where he buried Sarah in verse 9. It is the cave of Machpelah in verse 9, 23 verses 9. We'll see that later on. Looking at my notes, chapter 25. Chapter 25, when Abraham dies, we look in verse 9. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. So Abraham planned ahead, and we're going to come back to that later because there's other commands to go and bury my bones in the promised land. So Abraham planned ahead. He got the cave to bury his wife, and he also planned to be buried in the same place there. And we'll revisit that theme later on in the history. All right, so that's some notes on Isaac. And then, as Hebrews mentioned, Isaac, through faith, invoked future blessings for his sons. And we'll go and read that in Genesis 27. So Isaac, we're skipping over a lot of his life. We talked about the beginning, his marriage, and now we'll talk about the end. Now, when Isaac is blessing his sons towards the end of his life, we'll read in Genesis chapter 27, verses 26. Now, there's some trickery involved here, but some of that trickery might be providence also, since Jacob was the one that was chosen to be the forebearer of the lineage. So Genesis 27, verses 26, then it reads, Then his father Isaac said to him, Come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. And then let's turn over to chapter 28 also. Chapter 28, verse 1 reads, Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and directed him, You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women. Arise, go to Padan Aram in the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give the blessing of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. Then Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram, to Laban, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau's mother. So, the third generation of promise. This time, Isaac continues that promise. Isaac continues the command for Jacob to take a wife from their own lineage, again, keeping that pure and adulterated from the pagan lands. And Isaac invokes the same blessings that's very similar that was bestowed to Abraham and Isaac there. So the third generation there. So again, going back to the theme, the future viewing faith, long-term blessings spanning multiple generations. You know, this isn't an overnight get-rich-quick scheme. This is a hang in there, multiple generations of blessings await, but we must remain faithful for the long haul over a long period of time. I think another interesting thing, just a side point, we read about Rebekah conceiving in chapter 25, verse 21. It says, Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. We don't know much detail there, but you think about, again, the parallels with Abraham and Sarah and the challenges they had with being barren and having the delayed blessing of children there. So I want to pause there. That covers 2 generations and starts on the third of this 4-generation history class. Any thoughts, comments on that before we move on to Jacob? So we're going to think about long-term faith, what our faith means for the future. Abraham's faith set up Isaac to be faithful. Isaac's faith set up Jacob to be faithful. And they're able to look back on previous generations, see signs of faith, and we see the repeat covenant from generation to generation, reinforcing God's promises over time. So let's go and talk about Jacob. Now, we don't have much time to go and go into much detail here. So again, if we go and look at Hebrews 11 and think about exactly what is mentioned here, Hebrews 11 verse 21 reads, "By faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff." So Jacob, what we see in Hebrews 11 is only the final chapter when he is blessing his sons at the end of his life. So let's turn there to Genesis chapter 47. So by this point, Jacob has seen his son Joseph. He appears to be killed. Jacob goes into deep mourning. He lives a vast majority of his life thinking that his son is dead. Then towards the end of life, he is reunited. The family comes back together, and there's just a lot of healing that takes place there. So if we go to Genesis chapter 47, let's look at how even at the end of Jacob's life, he is looking to the future and thinking about blessings and the covenants which he will not see, but he's at the same time setting up the future generations to remain faithful and to be steadfast to the Lord. So Genesis chapter 47, Genesis chapter 47 verses 29. Let's read that passage. "And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, 'If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place.' He answered, 'I will do as you have said.' And he said, 'Swear to me.' And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed." Translation note, here it says, "bowed upon the head of his bed." In my translation, some translations say bowed over the head of his staff. In Hebrews, it says that he invoked blessings while bowing over the head of his staff. So a little bit of ambiguity there. But with that detail from Hebrews, there's a future viewing faith. There's this final blessing and command, and then he bowed in prayer. So note a couple things, the imagery. Jacob calls Joseph and calls for him to promise, but says, "Put your hand under my thigh." Now, I don't know what that looks like, but we had the same wording when Abraham called his servant to go and find a wife for Isaac. He says, "Put your hand under my thigh and promise me. Promise me to find a wife for Isaac from the family of Abraham." And here, Jacob says, "Promise me, put your hand under my thigh, that you will bury me with my fathers." So we go back to Abraham planning the burial cave for Sarah, and he plans to be buried there with Sarah, with her remains. Jacob, at the end of his life, wants his bones to be taken back to their new homeland and wants to be buried with his fathers there. So he's planning after his death. And again, think about the signal that would send to the people that would carry his remains to be buried with his fathers. They're saying, "This is your true homeland. Egypt is a whistle stop. Don't bury me in Egypt. Bury me with my fathers." Thinking long term and thinking about what that symbolizes and what that means as to our temporary homeland and our permanent future homeland. Now, Hebrews mentions the blessings to his sons. We see that in chapter 48, where he blesses his grandsons, the two sons of Joseph. And then in chapter 49, Jacob blesses his sons one by one in a poetic passage. Time doesn't allow us to read that entire passage, but to summarize, his blessings aren't exactly blessings for all of his sons. He's pretty critical for 4 of his sons, and he has some mixed blessings for 2 of them. So he's very critical on Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Dan. And just for example, starting off in 49 verses 2, when Jacob starts blessing his sons, he says, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Return to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, and you defiled it. He went up to my couch." Talking about some of the sordid history we read about when Jacob was sent away, and some of the troubles that Reuben got into. So not all the blessings to his sons are favorable. There's mixed blessings to Issachar and Gad, but then there's positive blessings for Judah, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Benjamin, and Joseph himself. What I want to read here, we think about future viewing blessings and the long-term outlook that Jacob had even at the end of his life. Jacob isn't going to live to see any of these blessings come to fruition. But I want to focus on his blessings to Judah especially. And here we see a blessing that's going to be fulfilled in a few thousand years from Jacob's time. So let's read Jacob's blessing to his son Judah, starting in Genesis 49, verses 8. It reads, "Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk." So we have what we know as a Messianic prophecy here. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So at the end of Jacob's life, he's blessing his sons, and through providence and through faith, some of his blessings to Judah is a shadow of what's going to be coming with the Messiah, about 2,000 years from this time in history. So again, think about the future viewing faith of Jacob. Through faith and through the influence of God, he blesses his sons, and in doing so, he blesses the lineage that Christ is going to come from. So I'll pause there for any thoughts or comments on that. Part of me wonders if Jacob knew that eventually the Messiah would come through the bloodline of Judah, or if that was, a divine inspiration, providential influence on that. We think about, future viewing faith and thinking thousands of years from now we'll have the Messiah come to the earth. Any thoughts on that? So we're going over this history very briefly, and we're covering about 200 years in a few minutes through this synopsis. The final thing I'll cover is on Joseph himself. Again, Joseph being one of the most noble figures in all of the Old Testament. We don't have time to go into all the notable things in his life here. But in Hebrews 11, verse 22, it says, "By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones." Now we read about that in Genesis 50, starting in verse 24. Genesis 50:24, as we close out this book, it says, "And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." So at the end of his life, Joseph is saying something very similar to what his father Jacob said: "Carry my bones from here. Be buried with his fathers in their true homeland." So some things that all these heroes of faith had in common: they never acclimated to the culture around them. Again, Abraham was a stranger among the Hittites, but they still saw him as a prince of God. They revered him, but he didn't acclimate to their pagan culture. And then, in future generations, they remained pure in their families. They married into Abraham's lineage. They did not intermarry into the pagans. They were determined to stay separate. We read about some of Joseph's adventures in Egypt. He stayed separate. He didn't fall into any of the worldliness around him. And they didn't get comfortable. They stayed faithful to the Lord. They were blessed. We read about they were often rich. They had success. They had a lot of land and livestock. But they still had a temporary dwelling attitude. They knew that they were sojourners in a foreign land, and eventually their true homeland was the homeland promised by God in the future. And ultimately their homeland was united with God in heaven. We really didn't get to have much discussion in this class, did we? I think we could take some lessons here. I'm sorry? I do a terrible job of estimating how much material to cram into this. I wanted to go and cover, the history of these 3 generations and draw out some high points, but there's just so much historical information and side points that I can't not talk about that. I apologize. I don't mean this to be a lecture. I really value the communication and the discussion that we have. I hope that we could take away from this. We have examples of a far future promise in the Scriptures. We have promise of a far future blessing now. We have being reunited at home in heaven with Christ. We have long-term spiritual blessings in this world. We have our ultimate blessings after this world is over. So we got to make sure our faith, like these heroes in faith, our faith must be greater than our desire for short-term materialisms or short-term blessings, short-term comfort. All those things that would conflict with following God's commands. And then finally, like these heroes of faith, let's make sure our faith is also strong on behalf of our descendants. Thinking about our kids, our grandkids, great-grandkids, people that we will never meet. Again, my kids aren't going to remember my grandfather I've been talking about, but I'm hoping that his influence on me turns around to be an influence on them, and that their future spiritual blessings is credible to that influence of faith that others have had on me. So I appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you for your patience and bearing with me. I feel like a history teacher more than a Bible class leader in this class, but thank you for bearing with me, and I hope it was still beneficial and edifying. And at this time, let's go ahead and be dismissed in prayer. Looking around for eye contact. Cordell, would you lead us in prayer, please?